Welcome to the Unstuck Church podcast, where each week we're exploring what it means to be an unstuck church. Certainly every pastor would like their church to be more invested and more on mission together. But engaging busy people in the work of the Great Commission is a challenge that many pastors find tough. So the question is, how do we help people live on mission within their typical rhythms of life? On this week's podcast, Tony and Amy continue our series on reaching and connecting with new people with a conversation with pastors John and Dave Ferguson on how you can help the people of your church be a blessing to their friends and neighbors. Before we go there, though, if you're new to the podcast, go to theunstuckgroup.com/podcast and subscribe to get the show notes in your email. When you do, you'll get resources to support each week's episode, including our Leader Conversation Guide. Again, that's theunstuckgroup.com/podcast. Now, before this week's conversation, here's Tony.
Giving presents challenges for growing churches. Cumbersome donation forms and dated administrative features of most giving systems leave you lacking the tools you need. But SecureGive's 7-in-1 system makes donating easy and secure and provides in-depth analytics and management tools for your team. It also integrates with your church management system. It's a system that scales to fit the needs of growing churches. For our Unstuck listeners, SecureGive is offering 6 months of free software to get your church started. You can visit securegive.com/unstuck to learn more.
Well, welcome back to all of our listeners. We are now in week 3 of our series on reaching new people and connecting them to your church. And in today's episode, we're going to talk about how leaders can encourage and mobilize their congregations to reach and connect others. But Tony, before we do that, I don't know, where have you been these days? How's life been for you? I think you had a marriage again in your family.
Yeah, we're having weddings all the time around here now at the Morgan household. But on top of that, life has been just fun because I've been to Austin working with a couple great churches there. I've been to Asheville working with a couple great churches there. And I feel like I'm on the Keeping Things Weird tour. So if you're in Portland and you lead a church, just let me know, because two great communities, Asheville and Austin, but they're both a little bit weird. So it's been fun.
They are a little different. Yeah, I was just down in South Carolina and came back to my first Minnesota snowfall really of the year. So now I feel like life is evened out and we're all back to normal now that there's just white surrounding my house. Well, anyways, like I said, today's episode, we're going to talk about how leaders can encourage and mobilize their congregations to reach and connect with others, because after all, that's really what our job as leaders is, right? It's not to do everything ourselves, which can be hard for some of us because that's why we got into ministry. We love to do stuff. But at the end of the day, our job really is to empower and mobilize our church so that they make the mission their own and that they are doing the work of the ministry.
That's exactly right, Amy. And today we're going to hear a conversation with John and Dave Ferguson. John and Dave are brothers, by the way, but they also pastor a great church in the Chicagoland area. And they've created an outreach and an evangelism strategy called the Blessed Model, which is designed to do exactly that. We'll discuss in this conversation what the Blessed Model is and what makes it distinctive and how John and Dave have successfully implemented this model at Community Christian Church. So with that, here's my conversation with John and Dave. Dave, let's dive right in. Let me have you start by unpacking what Bless is for those who might not be familiar with the model.
Yeah, I'll maybe before I do, I think part of it for us, and writing this book, and the book really came out of us actually implementing this at our church, was I think there's just a lot of confusion, and I'd say even increasing confusion about how to love your neighbor and how to share the love of God with other people. I don't know if you saw this, Tony. You probably have, because you're on top of all this stuff, but we'll share it again. But Barna came back with some research, and they said that nearly half of practicing millennial Christians say it's wrong to evangelize. Specifically, it was 47%, so almost half. But what's kind of wacky about this, is that at the same time, they said that 2 out of 3 practicing Christians believe being a witness about Jesus is part of their faith. So it's hold it. So it's wrong to evangelize, but it is a part of my faith. And I think people are, if it sounds confusing, I think it's because people are genuinely confused about, how do I love my neighbor and how do I share the love of God? And you got it. In the Bible too, love your neighbor, love your neighbor. I think it's like 8 times you got love your neighbor. And John and I can go back and forth and telling you a lot of different ways that we tried, especially in the early days of our ministry, that didn't work. But one of the things that we discovered along the way is it felt like the way that Jesus actually loved his neighbors was by being a blessing. Yeah. And so that's when it was really out of the Gospels and seeing what Jesus was doing. We kind of compiled these different consistent practices he had, and then we tried to put it in a way that was memorable, and it comes across as blessed. And these are the 5 practices. B, begin with prayer. L, listen. E, eat. S is serve, and S is story. So begin with prayer, listen, eat, serve, and share your story. And we'll, I think, elaborate more on those later on. And I'll throw one more thing out there. One of the things I think that really put us over the top, because you got it in the Bible, you got it that Jesus was doing it, but we ran across this study called Blessers versus Converters. And this was buried in a doctoral thesis that we found. 2 teams of missionaries went to Thailand, and actually one team went just as what they were kind of known as converters. They were going to win souls, okay? And the others were blessers, saying, hey, we're just going to be a blessing wherever God sends us. And they followed these 2 teams of missionaries for 2 years. And what they found out with the converters, they actually had only 2 people became Christ followers over those 2 years. And it had 0 kind of impact as far as socially or community building, making the place a better place where they lived. But what they discovered with the blessers, they researched that, is they actually saw 100 converts. 100 people said yes to following Jesus, but it actually created significant kind of social capital along the way as well. And so the irony was that the blessers were actually the better converters. So one of the things that we kind of came to the conclusion was like, maybe we need to stick closer to Jesus' model of how do we actually, bless people. And that's what we're talking about.
Yeah. All right. So, John, Dave kind of started down this path, but as you think about where you were a number of years ago, by the way, how many years ago when you rolled this out to your church?
I think initially, probably as many as 12 to 15 years ago when we first started, Dave, would you say?
Yeah, I think about 12 years ago. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what would you add to what David shared about what really prompted you to develop and share this model with your church?
Yeah, good question, Tony. I think really what prompted us was kind of our own frustration, that we experienced, and then also the frustrations that we saw in the lives of the folks who would consider a community their church home. Dave and I were fortunate enough to grow up in a Christ-following home. Pretty much our entire lives, we knew, what it means to experience and the hope and purpose that can only be found in a relationship with Christ. And naturally, when you experience that, you want to share it with people. And I think the sad part is that most of the ways we were taught to share it often kind of felt, like forced, or, maybe we were trying to get somebody to do something that they didn't seem like they really wanted to do. And I think most Christians probably have had that same experience. And so we felt it personally, but then we also saw it in the lives of the folks who were a part of our church and other churches too, and through New Thing, our network of churches across the globe. People knew the mission. Our mission at Community is, helping people find their way back to God. And I think if you talked to the majority of people at Community, they would be able to state that mission. And I think that it actually kind of does something inside of them. They're passionate about it. They can repeat it. They could tell you about it. But the truth is, many of them still felt the frustration about how to actually live it out. And so, it really was our own frustration, I think, along with what we saw in the lives of the people that we lead, that led us on this journey of discovery, which ultimately led us to, like what Dave said, it's the life and ministry of Jesus, where we discover these 5 everyday ways that he loved people and ultimately changed the world. So it really was. It was our own personal frustration with our own attempts at evangelism and reaching people, and then also what we saw in the lives of folks that we were trying to lead and who were really compelled by the mission, but just didn't know what does that really look like practically? How do I do this without, turning people away, which is the last thing anybody wants to do.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's the practical nature of it, which we'll get into more in our conversation, that really distinguishes this encouragement around Bless. Dave, for years along those lines, I think many churches have embraced that invest and invite model when it comes to engaging people outside the walls of the church. And I'm curious to hear from you, how is Bless similar to invest and invite, and then how might it be distinctive from that approach?
Yeah, I think it's an important question. I'm not against invest invite, but I think when it becomes your only or your primary method of trying to reach people and how to try to, love your neighbor, it's going to fall way short. And part of it is because, the invest invite approach is very kind of pastor centric. Most of the ownership for evangelism is on that one person, that person delivering that message and hoping it connects with that person. And in some ways, you might even say it's presentation specific because you're counting on this one moving event. But I think maybe even more important critique of kind of solely, again, I just want to stress that solely leaning on just invest invite, is that you're kind of assuming that people are at a certain point as far as being pre-evangelized. Do you remember there was a guy out of Wheaton had the Ingalls scale?
That's right.
Do you remember that, Tony?
Yeah.
So the Ingalls scale, basically, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm kind of trying to remember it all here. Basically, there were a lot of steps that they said led up to the point where you became a Christ follower. And they actually had numbers, like you could be 1 step away or 2 steps or 5 steps or 8 steps. And then there were steps on the other side. I think the invest invite assumes you are right there, just ready to take that step and say yes to Jesus. The thing I love about the Bless practices is, number one, where the ownership is really on you just to be a friend. John and I kind of joke sometimes when we're training people in this. It's like when you teach people the Bless practice, it's like a remedial course on how to be a friend.
It really is. But Dave, I think our culture, we need that in today's world, because it's the craziest thing, especially with social media. We're probably connected to more people than ever before. And yet we probably, if we're honest, have fewer friends than we've ever had. It's the craziest thing. And so I think it's good to think about Bless in those terms, because it's almost as if our culture, we need this.
And if you think about it, what was Jesus? His earned nickname was Friend of Sinner. And so maybe you got it right. So I think I like that part, is like, hey, let's just learn how to be a genuinely good friend like Jesus was. I like that it's also process oriented. That kind of takes people where they are and it allows them one step at a time, like we were talking about that Ingalls scale, to get to the place where they're going like, you know what? I think Jesus was who he said he was. And the other thing, and maybe we'll get a chance to touch on this too, some of the programs that maybe were popular in the past are things you had to add to your life. You got to show up on a Tuesday night. You have to do this thing, where with the Bless practices, these are things you already are probably doing. And it's how do you actually integrate these and be intentional about those in your life. So that's some of the stuff. So I'm not really against, kind of the invest invite. I just think when it becomes the only thing you're counting on, that's a silver bullet there. And
Yeah. So, still want to be prepared on Sunday to make sure we're welcoming people that may be there for the first time, and giving them an opportunity to hear the good news in our messages on Sunday morning, but complementing that 100%. With, yeah, absolutely. John, similarly, I think, I think you would say Bless is different. In fact, Dave actually acknowledged this up front compared to traditional evangelism strategies and programs that we've seen churches engage in the past. Would you agree with that? And how would it differ from some of those traditional evangelism strategies?
Yeah, I think Dave touched on it really well, in that this really is about how to be a good friend. And I think when you combine what you all mentioned, the fact that we're more friendless than we've probably ever been as a culture, And then when you look at the reputation that Christians have among non-Christians, we have a long ways to go. We've got to be better friends. And I think what Dave said too is that bless really, it's really not even a method or a model as much as it is a way of life. And it truly is how Jesus lived day in and day out. He just went about blessing the people and places he came across every single day. I mean, if you look at, the being blessed, it's begin with prayer. When Jesus started his earthly mission, what did he do? He first went out into a mountainside and he prayed. And I think over and over again, we see Jesus first retreating to pray. You could say that prayer preceded and permeated his mission, throughout his time on earth. If you look at the L and listen, which is listen and bless, no question that asking questions and then listening to people was central to Jesus' life and teachings. You think of the story of Bartimaeus, the man who was blind, crying out to Jesus for help. And, instead of coming to him immediately and asking or healing him, what did Jesus do? He asked him, what do you want me to do for you? Well, why do you think he asked him that question? Well, I think it was because he wanted to offer him the dignity of stating exactly what he wanted, and then to have the chance to confess his faith in Christ right then and there. And so over and over again, you see Jesus just living these things out, eating. I mean, good night. So much of Jesus' ministry was centered around eating meals together. He performed his first miracle at a wedding feast. One of his most well-known miracles was feeding the 5,000, right? The night before his crucifixion, he brings his friends together for a meal. So every one is, and then you go to serve. Jesus could have been more clear when he said the Son of Man did not come to be served, but what? To serve. And he showed that over and over again. So, you're talking about something that really is an expression of how Christ lived, and which is what we as Jesus followers are intended to do anyway. And it's just an attractive way of living that I think has a way of drawing people closer and closer to Jesus as you live this out.
Dave, just to help for folks that are listening, I think pastors and church leaders are going to be intrigued by this. If you could share how you've seen Bless change people's lives in your church, and then even more broadly, how it has impacted the health and growth of your ministry.
Sure. I mean, one of the things that John and I are both, big believers in is you reproduce who you are. And where's my I got my journal. Anyway, my journal, I don't have it near me here, but like even this morning, I'll write the word bless, and I write there's 5 different couples that are in my neighborhood that I'm praying for every day. And one of the stories I love to tell, because this is one of those times where for me it was and again, I know this is going to sound bad to your listeners, because I think I started with Jesus did it, but I needed a doctoral thesis to prove it to me. You know what I'm saying?
Tony, you might not know this, Tony, but Dave reads doctoral theses just all the time. He's got a stack of them on his nightstand. He's remarkable about that.
Well, the other thing I was going to confess too is, John just went through and talked about how Jesus did all these blessed practices. But there was a part of me that was kind of like, you know what? Maybe it's a good way to love people, but am I really going to see anybody become a Christian? I'm just keeping it real. And for me, I think what put me over the top was my friend Michael. I had a friend, Michael, who, I was praying for him every day. And he was a guy that I knew through my son's cross country and track team. And so I started doing the blessed practice. So I'm praying for him every day. And you have to know a little bit about Michael. He's a kind of a hard-nosed skeptic. And I remember the first time we even started talking about anything to do with church. And I won't use the language he used, but basically he's like, I don't want have anything to do with that BS. And but he kind of liked me, and I liked him. And so I'm praying for him. And every time we'd go to a cross-country track meet, we'd always hang out there cheering for our boys, and we would talk. He would talk, and and I would listen to him. And at some point, actually, he initiated with me. He said, "Hey, you know what? I got some questions I'd love to bounce off you." He said, what if we got together for breakfast sometime? And I was like, yeah. And so we started eating breakfast together. And then sometimes he had a knack for finding new restaurants, and he always liked to introduce these new restaurants to me. So then we'd go out to these new restaurants, do that kind of thing. And so now I'm praying for him. I'm listening to him. We're doing meals together. And again, kind of like we joked before, we're becoming like friends. And I remember we were at a breakfast place, Experience Cafe, in the corner booth. And he's told me, he said, you know what, Dave, it was 20 years ago today. And I was like, what? And he'd already hinted at some of the stuff, but he began to unpack that it was 20 years ago, and that was actually anniversary day, where he'd been in a car accident with his best friend Jay, and his best friend Jay died in that car, and Michael survived. And actually, Michael was found negligent. And he said, I have to tell you, for 20 years, I felt the burden of trying to live two lives, one for me and one for my friend Jay. And basically, he was going like, where do I find forgiveness for that? And I got to, and he knew I was a Christian by that point, of course. And I got to share, yeah, here's how I've found forgiveness, and not only forgiveness, but then also like redemption. Like he can take the crappiest stuff in your life and actually end up using it for great good. And I got to see him say yes to Jesus. So I'm sharing the story then, right? And I got a chance to baptize him. And whenever I get a chance to tell that story, to me, as pastors, if you're in a pretty dynamic church, you'll see people come to faith, and you get a chance to baptize people, but they're not always your friend. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
But in that case, it was like my friend. And it was just really cool to be able to, get to, I think be a good friend to him. And because I think a lot of people, and here maybe I'll broaden it now, because I think our people in our churches are going like, okay, how? Give me the how. How do I love my neighbor? Because I think most people that are coming to our churches, they want to. They just don't know how. And that's one of the things I've appreciated for me personally, and I've seen in the life of our church. It gives us real clear handles on here's how you can do this in a way that fits who you are. So that's kind of how it's impacted me and our church.
Yeah. So, John, on that note, let's get practical here. And maybe if you can kind of go back in time a little bit, when you first began to introduce Bless to Community Christian Church, how did you encourage folks in your ministry, in your church, to begin to engage this and to begin to bless others? Practically, what did that look like?
Yeah, good question, Tony. And, we really do encourage people to wake up every day and begin with prayer. Just start right there and ask God, maybe even before your feet hit the floor when you're getting out of bed, God, who do you want me to bless today? And I love how Dave, talked about that journal that he's keeping where he's got that list of people. I've got it on my smartphone too. Same thing. I'm praying for certain people, but then I'm also saying, God, you know what? There might be serendipitous opportunities throughout the course of the day too that I'm not even aware of yet, where you're going to give me a chance to bless somebody. And so it's really twofold. It's like what you're planning to with a certain list of people, but then there's also those opportunities that the Holy Spirit, gives me throughout the course of the day when I'm really on top of things. Those sometimes are even the most fun. And so I think it starts there with just encourage people to make this a part of their life. We also encourage people, and if you look actually in our book, Bless, and at the end of chapter 3, there's a graphic that asks you to fill out a who is my neighbor map. And then there you can list as many as 8 people that you'd like to bless. And it can be people that, live nearby. It can be people you work out with. It could be people that you work with. But I think the point is to get super intentional. And like Dave said, that along with like the journal, and then in small groups, we're encouraging people when they show up. We ask our leaders to make that intentional part of the conversation. So you're asking the people in your group, okay, who did you bless this week? And guess what? If you say, well, I began with prayer and I'm praying for Joe, Susan, and Sam, that counts. And that's one of the things I love about the Bless. I think it elevates prayer and says, no, prayer is not the least we can do or the last thing we should do. It's the first and most important thing we can do. And that's an actual missional practice. That's a way that you're befriending people and hopefully helping them find their way back to God. So in small groups, in addition to that, we do message series, every year, multiple message series on Bless. It's also sprinkled out throughout other messages on the weekends. And then we have classes where we're training and equipping people that want to take a deeper dive. I will say this, though, and I think one of the mistakes a lot of churches can make is they'll want to dive into a message series first as a way to implement bless. And I think David agrees with me. We always say, no, back off. You first. You first take it. You make your list, read the book, and start living it out yourself. So you've got, what Dave shared, that's priceless, right? For him to be able to get up and actually say, no, I'm not just asking you to do this. This is a part of my daily life already. Then circle up with your leadership team and you start living that out as well. Do that before you train your staff and before you do the message series, so you can genuinely create like a culture of bless throughout your entire church.
Dave, as we talked about earlier, this is something that Community Christian Church has been engaging for now more than a decade. How do you keep this fresh, especially for folks who have been around your church for many years?
Yeah, well, Tony, first of all, to be intentionally redundant, I've said it, John said it, but I'm going to say it again. As a church leader, you have to do it. And you may be like, okay, how does that keep it fresh? Well, it keeps it fresh because you are a culture creator. And when you do it, you're going to, the behaviors that you've bought into and the practice that you bought into are going to get reproduced in the life of your church. So if you want to keep it fresh, you keep doing it, and then you'll keep talking about it, and you'll keep having stories. In addition to that, one of the things, John touched on this too. We have a series we'll do on it almost every year. We drip it into different teachings throughout the year. We have training that we do. We also on Sundays, we do something, a video every week called Be the Church. And it's usually kind of an update on some exciting thing that's happening in the life of Community Christian Church. And about once a month, we try to introduce also a blessed story. So they get to hear a story from someone on that. But I think one of the things that John and I are probably most excited about that's going to be new is we're partnering with the Bless Every Home app. And I don't know if you've seen that or not, but
I've heard about that. Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it is a great tool, and it's been around for a little while, but we're just really kind of starting, it's surprising it hasn't happened before now, a partnership with them. And we're going to completely redo it. But if you log into this app, and for people listening, it'll be at least the next version will be available sometime in March. It actually it's got a really robust database behind it. So it actually will tell you the names of your neighbors. And so then out of that, you can make a daily prayer list and you can pray for them. And then it'll actually, in time, what we're working through is, so you'll actually, it has some kind of almost like gamification to it, so that you're going, hey, yeah, I prayed for that person, I listened to that person, I ate with that person, I served that person, I shared my story. And so you can really keep track of. And for church leaders, the thing that's going to be really cool is you'll actually be able to, like say, Tony, you got a church of 100 folks. You better look and go like, hey, look, 75 of my folks are using the Bless app. And 50 of them prayed for people this week. And 25 of them listened, and 10 of them had meals with people. And you could bring that every Sunday and really celebrate, hey, and catch them doing it right. Here's what we're doing. And I think that's one of the ways it's going to keep it really fresh. And John and I are both very pumped about that.
I could just chime in real quick.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, Tony, one of the things that's cool about that too is I feel like so often the only way we've been able to measure our evangelistic efforts is when someone commits their life to Christ. And a lot of churches, it's through adult baptism. And let's face it, Scripture talks about what Paul plants the seed, Apollos waters. We don't know how our efforts are going to reap fruit down the road. Now we get to actually, I think, in a really cool, sort of helpful way and encouraging way, give people the opportunity to kind of measure the fact that, yeah, they're actually making efforts evangelistically in a number of different ways that will eventually contribute to somebody, placing their trust in Jesus and committing their lives to Christ, and they can measure that. And I'm just hoping that that's going to be an encouragement to a lot of folks out there too.
That's good. So John, just tell me, with Bless, is that your only strategy at Community Christian Church for reaching new people? And if not, what are some other strategies that you're engaging to reach new people who are currently outside the church and maybe even outside the faith?
Yeah, Bless, again, is the primary way we're training and equipping individuals to live out their faith. But, everything, hopefully, we do at Community revolves around this idea of helping people find their way back to God. And, like many churches, we're seeing more and more people online, at communityonline.tv. We're seeing thousands of people engage with us digitally through that platform. We're seeing God do some really incredible work, Tony, right now through our micro churches. Dave probably has the latest number, but I think we have close to 3,000 people locally and globally that are now engaging with us through these smaller churches that are led by people who want to reach people who we normally wouldn't be able to reach. We also know that, God reaches people as the church goes about the work of restorative justice. And so our community cares ministry and our church multiplication work through New Thing in the city and in other places locally and globally is also reaching people who don't know Jesus. And so, there's probably a lot of different ways, but in terms of
we gotta give a plug for Alpha though. Alpha's been a huge help to us as well. And if it's interesting, if I don't know how much have you ever done Alpha, Tony?
I've not personally, but a lot of churches that we're working with are engaging with Alpha. Yes.
I mean, again, I got nothing. I got no stake in this game, but I think the two best evangelistic tools in a post-Christian era that we're living in right now is I would say the Blessed Practice and Alpha. And if you look at Alpha too, I mean, it's very much, it's kind of like a concentrated version of the Blessed Practices, because I mean, you're praying for people before you invite them. You show up and they create a community where there's no wrong. There's any question can be answered. Any question could be asked. You're there really just to listen to people's questions, their doubts. The ones that do it right, they also have a meal. So they're eating together, so they're developing real community. And you get a chance then to serve them by responding to their questions. And they always share the gospel story. I mean, I think those two things, if you do want to centralize a program around it, I think Alpha is great, and it works hand in glove with your people using the Blessed Practices.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I'm actually in an Alpha group right now. I'm a huge fan of Alpha. It's such good stuff.
Well, I think it's just good for pastors to hear too that there are many strategies that we can be using to share the good news beyond the walls of the church, and it's good to be thinking about maybe multiple ways to connect with people rather than just a strategy, but it's also good reminder. We have to have this framework, this focus around how we're encouraging people, though, to engage with people outside the walls of the church as well. And that's where Bless can come in. We alluded to this a little bit earlier, Dave, but I also know you have some great Sunday services at Community Christian Church. So what role do you think the church's weekend services should have in reaching new people?
We touched on a little bit. I do think, I mean, what you're really wanting to create is an evangelistic culture where everybody, that becomes the norm. And I think you can do that through your weekend services. And I think through the teaching of those biblical values, through telling those kind of stories, through actually also sharing how you are living out those behaviors yourself, creates that kind of culture. You can do equipping through your teaching. One of the things that we also do, we just had 3 weeks ago, we had a commissioning service. And this is an annual deal for us where we ask people, hey, if you're willing to make a commitment and you're going to be on mission and use these blessed practices, where you live, work, and play, we want you to come forward. We want you to know we are for you. We want to pray for you. So we anoint them. It's almost like your ordination, and we send them out. And I'd throw this in too. I mean, because we were talking about the invest and invite. I think there are times where you go no, we need to ask people, okay, are you ready to make a commitment to Jesus? And I think, and sometimes that best happens in a weekend service. And I think go for it.
Yeah. And that's, I think, the point I wanted to get to. This is not an either or conversation. This really is a both and conversation. All right, John, let me wrap up here. I know there are going to be pastors that are interested in using Bless with their congregations. So what are some specific steps you would encourage them to take as they begin to explore how to really roll this out so that folks are blessing their neighbors, blessing folks in their lives?
Yeah, sure, Tony. Yeah, I mean, shameless plug. I would encourage people to buy the book, Bless, 5 Everyday Ways to Love Your Neighbor and Change the World. I think it is a good place to start. And I would go to that chapter 3 and fill out that map, make your own list of the people you believe God wants you to bless. and then get your leadership team, to do it along with you. Start asking each other, who did you bless this week? I think that's a great way to start. For more information on that, folks can go to bless-book.org. We also have a Bless Family resource, which is great for helping families, children and parents together become blessers in their neighborhood. We've got a great series of videos that can be used in small groups. And, finally, Dave mentioned the app. I think the app's another great tool. Really, I mean, if anybody wants to know any more about any of this, they're more than welcome to email Dave or myself, John Ferguson, Jon Ferguson at communitychristian.org, Dave Ferguson at communitychristian.org, and we'll put you in touch with the right people to get whatever help you need to start blessing people as soon as you can.
Well, Tony, what a great conversation. It's so clear and evident how passionate John and Dave are about mobilizing their church to reach their community and reach their friends. There's so much good stuff in there, Tony, but what stood out to you from that conversation?
Well, we've had John and Dave on before to discuss Bless, but I truly do think it's an effective way to get your church involved and on a mission. And as Dave said, a lot of evangelism programs are about adding things or events to your life. Bless, though, it's really about being intentional around the things that you're already doing every day, praying, eating, meeting new people, and just making this a way of life.
Yeah, absolutely. And here I wrote this quote down. It's not a method or model as much as it is a way of life. And it's how Jesus lived day in and day out. So anyway, I love that. What else stood out, Tony?
Well, I think a big question for pastors is, how do I roll this out? Something like the Bless strategy to the church. And their answer was so compelling because, as a reminder, it starts with you. You and your leadership team need to be practicing this in your own lives first. From there, Dave and John explained how they've gone all in on Bless by incorporating it into weekend messages, a teaching series every year, monthly testimonial videos. They do training around this, and they even have a commissioning service so that people can really step into this mission in their daily lives. And I think it was John who said, pastors, you're going to want to dive right into a message series on this, and that's a mistake. Train your staff before you do the message series so you can genuinely create a culture of blessing throughout the entire church.
Yeah, that's so good, Tony. And as Dave said, that's one strategy for keeping this fresh for you and for your church. I mean, if we're doing this well ourselves as a staff and a leadership team, there should always be more stories of life change that we can share and celebrate. And what's more encouraging than that? We often talk to our teams, Tony, about our invite culture. We couldn't expect our body to be inviting their friends and family if us as leaders and staff in the church weren't doing that. And that's the same kind of challenge here. So, Tony, any more final thoughts before we wrap up today's conversation?
Well, first, let me just reiterate a couple of resources that John and Dave shared, and we'll list these in the show notes, but their book is called Bless, 5 Everyday Ways to Love Your Neighbor and Change the World. And then don't forget the app that they mentioned, which will really help you get to know better the people in your neighborhood. It's called the Bless Every Home app. And as they suggested, I mean, it's a great app, but it's even going to be better in the coming weeks as they refresh. And as a reminder, we'll be discussing how you can use weekend services to reach new people and connect them to your church at an upcoming webinar on February 29th. And you can register now to join us at the link in your show notes. And be sure to come back and join us next week for our last week of the series on reaching and connecting new people.
Well, thanks for joining us on this week's podcast. As Tony mentioned, we'd love to have you join us on our upcoming free webinar happening February 29th on reaching and connecting new people to your church. To register and learn more, follow the link in your show notes. And if you don't yet have the show notes, just go to theunstuckgroup.com/podcast to register. Next week, we're back with another brand new episode. Until then, have a great week.